Greetings, my lovelies. This is Blake here, and welcome to my review of X-Men Days of Future Past, which I'll just probably refer to as X-Men 4. Now, I have to admit, in the weeks prior to this film actually being released, my interest in X-Men 4 suddenly seemed to deflate, and I wasn't really sure why. After all, when this film was first announced and they revealed the concept, which would involve time travel, the end of the world, Sentinels, the old cast meeting the newer cast, all of that sounded amazing, and it seemed like the perfect idea that would get this franchise back on track. And the more I hear about it throughout its production, the more excited I became. Bryan Singer was returning to the franchise, and he'd be directing the movie, and a lot of people felt that once he left after doing X-Men 2, that's when the X-Men movies started to kind of fall apart. And other cast members became attached to the project, like Peter Dinklage. So everything I'd hear about X-Men 4 just sounded amazing. And then the trailers were released, and it looked just as good as I hoped it would. And the reviews started coming in pretty early, and everybody was almost unanimously positive at that time. And yet, once again, just suddenly out of nowhere, I just lost all interest in this movie. I was thinking maybe it was because Godzilla had been released the previous week, and Godzilla was my most anticipated film of 2014, so perhaps all my excitement was just focused on that film, and X-Men 4 just seemed like an afterthought in comparison. That's possible, but it doesn't really seem like something I would do. I've never held that against a movie before. The only real question is, what is the current competition like? And the only other flick that was playing opposite of X-Men 4 was Adam Sandler's Blended, and just no. I still have nightmares over grown-ups too. So I doubt that was, and I was thinking maybe it was because of the very uncomfortable controversy surrounding Bryan Singer. He has been accused of having sex with minors, and knowing me, that is something that would affect my judgment because it's happened before. I have a lot of difficulty watching Roman Polanski's movies because whenever I try, I can't focus on the objective quality because I'm being distracted by the fact that this director raped a girl and then fled the country, and I almost feel like I'm supporting him whenever I, attempt to watch one of his movies. And for a long time I could not watch a Woody Allen flick because, for the longest time I could not focus on the objective quality once again, because all I'd see was this director pretty much married his daughter, even though there is more to that story. And I eventually got over it, but then I still haven't been able to watch the Jeepers Creepers films since learning what the director of those films was guilty of. So I've been called out on this in the past, but I just can't help it. It affects my enjoyment of watching those films, so I don't even try. But I've decided that that's probably not the case here because it's too early to really judge Bryan Singer based on something that he may or may not be guilty of. All there has been is allegations, no evidence yet. So I'll make my decision on whether I'll have to stop watching his movies when we learn more of what really happened or not happened in the future. So once again, why was my interest in X-Men 4 so minimal by the time it came out? Well, it eventually occurred to me that I'm really not the biggest fan of the X-Men franchise. I thought I was, but when I actually started putting my mind to it, I realized that none of these films really impressed me that much. I've only dabbled in the comics and the cartoons in the past, so I have no real attachment to anything X-Men related other than the movies. But X-Men and X-Men 2, they're solid flicks, but I think they're overrated, and the only reason people hold them in such high regard is when they came out, the competition was so poor. I mean, Batman and Robin was still fresh on our minds back then, so of course X-Men and X-Men 2 are going to seem so much better in comparison. I think Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2 also suffer from the same issue. Then X-Men 3 and X-Men Origins Wolverine are generally regarded as inferior to the first two X-Men flicks, and I agree, they're not as good. And that leaves X-Men First Class, which is the only X-Men movie I consider to be exceptional. I do love that film, and but that's one film in an entire franchise that I genuinely adore. And then you have the Wolverine, which most of the fandom did appreciate, but I didn't care for that one. To me, it was just a soap opera with mutants. I mean, when you have Wolverine taking on ninja, yakuza, and giant robots, but you're more interested in focusing on this sappy, fluffy, standard romance, then there's something wrong with you. That still gets on my nerves. So I just figured that it was pointless to really be excited to see X-Men Days of Future Past because I'd probably be disappointed. And you know what? I kind of was. X-Men 4 is a fun movie. I did enjoy it. I do not regret watching it. I'd say it's definitely better than the Wolverine, X-Men 3, and X-Men Origins Wolverine. And it's probably comparable to X-Men and X-Men 2. But even then, I'd say those two films were just more focused, more well-written, and they had less flaws than X-Men Days of Future Past did. But this is going to be a difficult movie to talk about because most of the things I'll discuss will make it seem like this is a bad movie. That's not the case. It's just that there's more flaws than there are strengths, but the strengths are overall more impactful than the weaknesses. So I will say that, yes, X-Men 4 is an entertaining movie. I thought it was very well paced, even though I have heard complaints in regards to, there not being as much action as there could have been, or the running time was just a little bit too long. I never had that issue at all. I never became impatient with the movie. I always enjoyed myself. If it wasn't the action scenes, then it was the character interactions. So I thought it moved very nicely, and the action was good. I enjoyed seeing the different mutant powers, and the special effects were flawless. That's one area I definitely say X-Men 4 surpasses X-Men First Class, and it felt like X-Men First Class, even though it had a better script, it felt like they slashed the budget so much, so some of the special effects did look off. But here, I never had that problem. Whether it was makeup or CGI, everything I thought blended together very seamlessly. I liked the designs of the new Sentinels, or I should just say the Sentinels, even though they don't really look like their traditional design based on what I remember of the comics and old cartoons, but they also are more threatening, and I enjoyed how their powers could adapt to the mutants. That provided some really interesting fight scenes. And so, yeah, I could say that. I will say this, though. Bryan Singer might be a better director than Brett Ratner or Gavin Hood, but I think they're better action directors than he is. X-Men 3 was much more bombastic. It had bigger special effects and bigger action sequences than anything Days of Future Past had, and X-Men Origins Wolverine actually did have some very nicely choreographed fight scenes, which I thought was better than what X-Men Days of Future Past delivered. The fight scenes are still good here, but I thought those films had better action sequences, while X-Men Days of Future Past was superior overall. I also thought the Wolverine had better action scenes than X-Men 4 did, but the problem with those films was the Wolverine kind of got stuck on the character drama and ended up becoming too slow-paced for my tastes, especially as the characters were just walking cliches. And then X-Men 3, that was just all about the action and the spectacle, and the character drama really fell flat. But what Bryan Singer could do so much better than all these other directors is he could balance spectacle with character drama, so I was satisfied as both an action fan and as somebody who wanted to make an attachment to these characters. So every character has their own character arc. I really liked what they did with Professor X. It continues in the tradition of X-Men First Class in that you see where this person will eventually become, the mentor archetype that Professor X would become in X-Men 1 through 3, but he is much younger. He lacks the experience and the wisdom that he will ultimately gain much later on, but you do see the same character in there, but now he's much more conflicted. He is a much more flawed character, and at the same time they never really wallow in these flaws too much to where he becomes annoying. He could have easily been obnoxious by always complaining and whining, but I thought he gets on the right track quick enough, but at the same time it is always a struggle for him, and that made me really care for Charles's dilemma. And Magneto is also a very interesting character here because there's a big difference between older Magneto and younger Magneto. Older Magneto definitely feels a lot more remorse for his past actions. He is actually much more of a good guy, whereas here Magneto is still kind of the character you don't really want to put your faith in. He is technically a villain, even though he still aligns himself with the good guys. He's pretty much playing the same kind of role he did in X-Men 2. But the contrast I thought was really compelling, and it made me sad that those two never were able to interact, and I'll get into that later. And the actors have a lot to do. They get to showcase a variety of emotions, and they definitely get to do more than your average superhero character gets to do as an actor. And Mystique also gets probably her biggest role yet in all of the X-Men movies, where she also has to develop, and I really liked what they did with her too. Oddly, Wolverine, who is technically the protagonist, he doesn't have the character arc that everybody else does, but you also really feel you could see where he has developed throughout the course of this franchise, where he went from, kind of a selfish loner who was sort of dragged into these situations into somebody who definitely does want to help these people. So I enjoyed watching him too, and above everything, their interactions are all very fun to watch. Whether it's a more sad and dramatic and tear-jerking moment, I was moved, or when it was a funny moment, I always laughed. I enjoyed all their interactions, and that is definitely something you want in a movie that isn't always going to be non-stop action. So that alone makes X-Men Days of Future Past worth watching. Now, what is the problem? Well, for one, I thought the time travel idea was wasted. I didn't make sense either. I didn't get how Shadowcat could translate moving through doors and stuff to sending people back in time. I'm sure they explained it, but it was so rushed and underdeveloped that it just made no sense to me. I suspect that a lot of this film was left on the editing room floor because certain plot points are glanced over, like how did Mystique escape from Peter Dinklage's character in the canon timeline? It's going to be difficult to describe all this because apparently she was captured, tortured, and experimented on, and that's where the Sentinels eventually came from. Well, did she escape from him, or did she die? Because that doesn't really fit very well in with the events of X-Men 1 through 3. And the continuity of these X-Men films is so screwed up. Like, in the beginning of this film, you see that Wolverine has his metal claws once more, even though he lost them in the Wolverine, and this takes place in the farther future, so that was confusing. They never explained that. And then there's other things I can't really go into without spoiling, but like I said, the continuity is all messed up, and X-Men Origins was completely overwritten. That film could not have taken place within this timeline. And X-Men 3, I'd almost say the same thing in regards to Beast, who now has a cure to regress to his normal human state, but he doesn't have that ability in X-Men 3, even though he seems to support the idea of a cure, which he apparently had in the 70s, but he doesn't have now. But they also have flashbacks to X-Men 3, so that gave me a headache. But honestly, the whole time travel idea only feels like an excuse to reboot this franchise. They could have easily cut out the entire time travel sequence, and it could have been the exact same movie. Just say that somebody like Professor X suddenly had a vision of the Sentinels becoming a major threat in the future, so they have to stop it now, or another mutant could have had a prophecy, and they somehow get Wolverine to help them, and so they have a history before Wolverine loses his memories, and that would also tie in nicely with X-Men 3, where the Sentinels had a cameo, that the Sentinel program was shut down at the end of this movie, so Professor X would have a memory of them and would use them for training purposes, even though the Sentinels did not come until after X-Men 3 because of this. Like I said, it gets confusing, and I think the time travel idea just makes it even more confusing, because if the Sentinels didn't come until after the events of X-Men 3, how come they know of the Sentinels enough to where they make training exercises based around them during X-Men 3? Presumably Mystique maybe told people, but why did they not stop the Sentinels beforehand? Okay, it's actually a good idea that they rebooted this. Hopefully, for future X-Men movies, they could stick to a more streamlined continuity and not confuse the hell out of me. So I was hoping that there would be more interactions between the future characters and their past counterparts. Like I said, I would have really loved to see the Magnetos interact in some way, but all we get is really Wolverine going back in time, and they could have easily done that without the time travel if they just met Wolverine then and there, but whatever. I thought Peter Dinklage made for kind of a weak villain. His acting was good, but I didn't really know what I should feel about the character. He has his motivations that are understandable, but he's never sympathetic enough to where you feel bad for him or anything. That's always been kind of a trait of the X-Men movies, is the villains aren't just one-dimensional monsters, with the exception of Kevin Bacon's character. But like in a lot of ways, Peter Dinklage's character, I can't think of his name, he resembles Stryker from X-Men 2, and that he does have good intentions, but how he gets there, is definitely not very good. But at the same time, Peter Dinklage never has any tragic backstory to where you feel bad for him, but you never really see him do anything evil either, whereas with Stryker, you did see him do stuff that you would consider evil. So I could never bring myself to hate or like this character. Now, they say that he's tortured mutants in the past, but they're just telling us this. We never get to see it for ourselves, so I don't know, it just seemed like a wasted opportunity, even though I think Peter Dinklage has a pretty impressive presence, so the film was better for having him in it than if they just got any other person. Honestly, I think I've kind of run out of things to say. There were other issues I had with it, but I can't really remember them, or I can't really describe them without spoiling anything. But a lot of this movie did feel like it was cut out and left on the editing room floor, so important sequences were kind of rushed through. I wanted to see more of maybe the future segments and how they tied in with the past segments, but that's all I really have to say. It's kind of a mess. It is a very sloppy film in many ways. It's not as focused as X-Men and X-Men 2, but it did leave a positive impression on me, and hopefully this did get the franchise back on track, and subsequent X-Men movies will be better. Especially with the way this movie ends. But that's all I have to say. I did not do a written review, but I did do written reviews of Godzilla, or was it 13 Assassins? Or yeah, the Takeshi Miike samurai flick. I'm going to post a review of Godzilla King of the Monsters, or more specifically, I'm going to repost it since FreeWebs took it down, but I'll also re-edit it so it reads it much nicer. And follow me on Twitter and Facebook, and I plan on working on Critiquing the Critics this week. I start production on Tuesday, and hopefully I'll get that done sooner than later. I'm sorry for the delay there, guys. But that's all I have to say. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys later.